Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming in to our program today on bioscience innovation. We have a really exciting panel here today. Before we start, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Rena, a fellow Cornellian MBA candidate and a bioentrepreneurship fellow here at Cornell Johnson. So just a quick note to our viewers, this event is being recorded and will be viewable at this same URL afterwards. You may submit questions in the chat, and we do encourage you to ask questions. You can do this by opening the dialog box at the top right of your video player. Throughout our discussion, we'll be sharing URLs and resources in the chat, so keep a heads up for that. And if you're watching the archive recording, those links are available in the overview section just below. Just a quick shameless plug on the Bioentrepreneurship Initiative, which is hosting this program. The Cornell Bioentrepreneurship Initiative offers Cornell MBA students such as myself and doctoral candidates in health, life sciences, and related fields from across Cornell's campuses the opportunity to immerse themselves in real-world startup creation. Participants receive the tools, training, and connections they need to launch and lead their own life science startups through a certificate program offered by the Samuel Curtis Johnson Graduate School of Management. So who can apply? Participants are selected per annual cohort, of which half are MBA students and half are researchers, innovators, and/or clinicians in the life sciences. So if you are a PhD, MD, or doctor in veterinary medicine, you can apply. This also includes postdocs and junior faculty from across Cornell schools, such as the Weill Cornell Medicine, College of Veterinary Medicine, College of Engineering, and College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, as well as Cornell's tri-institutional partners, Rockefeller University and Memorial Sloan Kettering. You can get more information regarding the Bioentrepreneurship Initiative at the link you see on the screen, which will drop in the chat. So what is the purpose of this discussion? The premise of innovation in life sciences does not just come at the lab bench. We have two amazing founders here who are proving just that. Rather, broader innovations in engineering, computing, and elsewhere are also set to shift the paradigm in what we can do to advance life science and health. The two founders in this discussion are leaders in bringing new capabilities to the pharma industry specifically. Everyone, if we could just give a virtual round of applause for Mark Fingerhut, co-founder and head of research and development at Protein Cure, and William Bruey, CEO of Varda Space Industries. Mark and Will, if you could just introduce yourselves, your company's mission and thesis, that would be awesome.
Sure, thanks. My name is Will Bruey, also a Cornell alum, and I spent 7 years at SpaceX doing avionics and systems development and then working in mission control before leaving to learn about business and starting Varda Space Industries, where we use microgravity in orbit as a unique way to manipulate chemistry for chemicals that you could not otherwise make on Earth.
Awesome. And Mark?
Hey everyone, I'm one of the 4 co-founders and current head of R&D at Protein Cure, which is a computational drug discovery company here in Toronto, Canada. My background is in theoretical physics, mainly with a focus on quantum computing, which has been kind of an initial focus of the company, but nowadays we mainly focus on combining supercomputing technologies and molecular simulations with AI models in order to optimize small peptides and then sell them to pharma companies for therapeutic purposes.
Super interesting. So my first question for the both of you is that you both are kind of targeting the pharma industry. You know, how did you figure out such a niche need in the market, and why pharma? Why not apply your technologies or your capabilities towards other areas such as finance or manufacturing, I don't know, plastics, for example? Why pharma?
In our case, like in the early stages of the company, we did actually consider all of these different areas to go into. We considered agriculture, textiles, and food, since proteins kind of play a role in all of these in various ways. But at the end of the day, we made the decision to go for pharmaceuticals because it was the most straightforward industry to kind of break into, because there was already plenty of data available. There's like roughly 150,000 protein structures available on the internet that can be used for training and iteration, whereas the other types of industries just don't really have that sort of data availability, which kind of helped us pick pharmaceuticals, as well as proteins and peptides haven't really been a focus of pharma companies in the past, simply because of the complexity when it comes to designing them, because the state space is considerably larger than with traditional small molecules. And we've kind of seen like an opportunity there where we can kind of break in and bring technology that already exists and technology that we've built in-house to sort of tackle that problem and tackle that complexity and help pharma companies sort of expand their portfolio into the protein space. And then obviously there's sort of the altruistic reason of curing diseases and helping patients in the clinic, which is incredibly rewarding to myself, but also for the team to sort of generate a lot of pride and drive within the company to actually keep working on this.
Amazing. And Will, why manufacture drugs in space? Why not just manufacture them on Earth?
Yeah, great question. So the short of the long is that pharmaceuticals are the most expensive chemicals on Earth in any large market, and so by manufacturing in space, there's still a constraint for cost per kilogram to get to space and back. So it's the kind of obvious first large market that can be served by microgravity or manufacturing in microgravity that isn't in orbit. And the reason to do so is because by turning off gravity in perpetuity during a manufacturing process for a set of chemicals, you're able to manipulate that chemistry in a unique way that you could not do on Earth. Gravity is one of the four fundamental forces of physics, and so and you can't turn it off on Earth for any extended amount of time. So by going to space, it allows us to perform different chemistry than you could on Earth.
Amazing. I had no idea that there was a need, and I worked in healthcare for like a really long time. So awesome. Good to know. But why are your customers so excited about what you're offering? And kind of how do you differentiate yourself, you know, from other players in the industry or in this niche offering? I don't know of any other space station in space that's manufacturing drugs, but if there are any, how do you differentiate yourself?
Yeah, so some quick background. So if you imagine like the way to imagine it, if you're not familiar with this kind of concept, would be thinking about vinaigrette dressing in your refrigerator. If you let it sit for a while, it starts to separate, and the heavier elements of the salad dressing go to the bottom and the lighter go to the top. So if you imagine a chemical reaction that you wanted to perform, but you needed the mixture to remain homogeneous for an extended period of time, and let's say you couldn't shake it either because that would ruin whatever you're trying to develop if it's fragile, then the only way to execute that chemical reaction would be to turn off gravity for a while so that nothing sinks or nothing floats. And so that's the ability, that's kind of the first principle that we're allowed or that we're able to provide to our customers. And the reason why our customers are excited is because there's no other way to do that on Earth right now. And so the last 20 years, this among many other concepts have been researched and developed on the International Space Station. But the International Space Station is built as a research and development facility, not as a large-scale manufacturing operation. So our customers are excited because they've had business units that have been spending money on R&D, mostly Q projects, but also very useful if Q projects on the International Space Station, but also very useful if ever there was a manufacturing in space commercial solution. And so we're essentially the commercial off-ramp for all that research and development that has been done before. So for example, Merck sent up an experiment with Keytruda a few years ago on the International Space Station. So they're very excited that there is now a commercial off-ramp for that research that hadn't existed before.
Nice. I like the vinaigrette analogy. I will definitely remember that. I don't know, Mark, if you wanted to add anything into that question.
Sure. First of all, I'm pretty excited how space vinaigrette is going to taste like if it's perfectly homogeneous. Like in our case, I guess our main differentiator to a lot of computational drug discovery companies that are out there is that most of them focus on small molecules, which is kind of the historic focus of pharma companies, whereas we exclusively focus on small peptides and small proteins. And that kind of requires operating in a low data environment. Even though I mentioned earlier that in the pharmaceutical space, we already have a lot of data and publicly available protein structures, it's still the case that when it comes to protein therapeutics, we don't have a lot of activity data. And so that typically requires different machine learning approaches. You can't just kind of throw gigabytes or terabytes of data at a neural network. And then in our case, we also offer multi-property optimization. So instead of just optimizing a molecule for binding affinity, which is the thing that people tend to care the most about, we also kind of try to balance and at the same time optimize other properties such as solubility, serum stability, and basically things that make a molecule drug-like, which is something that our customers are really excited about because it kind of shortens their cycles that come after we deliver our molecules to them, because they don't need to spend a lot of extra time trying to modify these molecules further in order to actually ensure that they can become viable drugs. And so when we first started out with the company, we were one of the only few companies that actually could focus on this kind of niche. Nowadays, there's more competition, but we've kind of generated a lot of data together with our pharma partners that kind of can back up our claims and can show that we can contribute value. And we have kind of our first in vivo trials starting later this year, which is pretty exciting because that's going to kind of take it to the next step and show that these things don't just work in the Petri dish.
Yeah, that's amazing. I know the drug development timeline takes like 15, 20 years. So it's awesome to see that you're helping speed up that process. We need drugs ASAP, right? All right. Totally. So, all right. So could you guys just talk about kind of your journey capitalizing your company, and if you have any tips for founders? I know a lot of the people in the audience are aspiring entrepreneurs. So if you could just kind of share some words of wisdom there.
Yeah, sure. So I guess first and foremost, when you're getting invested in like a seed round, the typical team, product, and market are usually the three things folks will look at first, and with a huge emphasis on the team. You know, on day one, the people are literally the only thing. So the investor is really investing in you. So make sure to show them that they're getting a good shot on goal, if you will. So I think that would be number one. And then number two is remember that the investors, many of them at this stage, see multiple deals per day or multiple pitches per day. And so you really have to refine the pitch to be able to convey the value prop and why you're the person to do it in a very quick amount of time. So, the mistakes I made, for example, so that those in the audience don't have to make them, is, getting too technical, explaining the engineering aspect in great depth, being able to put it in related as close as possible to a lemonade stand business or another business model that folks are familiar with. It's definitely a little bit of pattern matching at the end of the day, and for the investor, and that's only because when you're at the high risk, high reward, long term investing, which was be our case, and I think probably Mark's as well, but correct me if I'm wrong. You're on the ragged edge of layers of high levels of abstraction. So being able to convey it in a way where it can be pattern matched to things the investor already knows is a key.
Oh, I just got muted. I very much agree with Will's points. I guess one thing, kind of a little story about how important team and storytelling is. In our case, like for our pre-seed round, that was like pretty much at the end of our incubation period at the startup incubator. I had a call with one of our first angel investors, and he was in the car, and his 4-year-old daughter was on the back seat. And this was our first call, and he asked me to essentially describe the company in simple terms such that his 4-year-old can understand it on the backseat. And
that.
after I gave him sort of that elevator pitch in a very dumbed down way, he was committed to invest in us, which was pretty mind blowing to me at the time. But I guess we kind of convinced him that we have the great team and that we're able to sort of convey these like really complex topics in simple terms, which I think is really important, because there is that tendency, especially coming from academia, to sort of really focus on all the details and the nitty-gritty stuff and get excited about the technological back-end stuff. But at the end of the day, that's not really what VCs care about. And often they also don't really understand those kind of deep technical topics. And I guess one other thing to add to is that we end up actually having different pitch decks for different types of VCs, because we're in this kind of awkward middle space of biotech where there's sort of the traditional biotech and bio investors, and then you have the tech VCs, and then there's sort of some tech platform VCs in the middle. And we typically have 2 pitch decks, one for the bio investors, one for the tech VCs, because the bio investors do tend to crave a little bit more data and sort of substance when it comes to the actual nitty gritty, whereas tech VCs don't really want to hear these kinds of things. And so we tend to kind of manage 2 pitch decks at the same time.
I love the 4-year-old in the backseat. I use the your non-technical uncle at Thanksgiving dinner, but I like yours better. I'm going to start using that.
Nice. Yes. So kind of going off of that, so your companies are very futuristic, they're very cutting edge and very ambitious. How do you go about, I guess, establishing early credibility enough for a VC to, let's say, give you like $50 million, when there's no space station or maybe collaborations that, you would need to kind of get that trust going? How does establishing credibility early on kind of look like for you?
Yeah, for me, it was showing that I knew how this business and the technology would work end to end, and pointing to previous experiences that gave me the moral authority to make those statements. So there comes a lot with having a background in the company that you want to start. That is a huge leg up. And if I, for example, wanted to change into, that is why Varda is a spacecraft company trying to do pharmaceuticals rather than a pharmaceutical company trying to do spacecraft. So your past and being able to articulate your experiences in a way that shows the investor that they will apply, and that you have line of sight from day zero to the potential unicorn outcome, but also be able to describe the very specific risks along the way that you're aware of and are ready to take on, even though you don't know the answer yet.
Well, do you have another co-founder that is on the pharma bio side, or have you simply kind of hired that part of the company after founding it?
Exactly, hired it.
Okay.
And the rationale was we have other products that are just less lucrative and exciting than our pharmaceutical line of business that are more space oriented. But the thinking was using those products as a stepping stone to get into pharmaceuticals over the past 18 months. And we've just probably over the last 3 months or so became empowered enough to take a swing at pharma.
Yeah, for us, it was very much kind of all centered around the incubator program that we co-founded the company at. So me and one of my other co-founders, Tomasz, we got invited to come to Canada and to participate in what's called the Creative Destruction Lab Incubator, which is a 9-month program where you have check-ins with VCs every 2 to 3 months. And that kind of enabled us to sort of, at every meeting, you would set some goals that you would want to hit in the next 2 to 3 months. And then you come back and you ideally demonstrate that you were able to hit those goals. And at the end, you get to pitch in front of a big room of investors. And that helped us to kind of establish credibility over the course of 9 months to really show that we're not like, usually you only have that sort of one contact point where you're raising your round, you pitch to the investors and they just kind of get to meet you in the pitch meetings. Whereas in this case, they kind of saw us evolve over a period of 9 months and kind of gain confidence in us being able to execute and actually stick to the things that we promise. So that was a big boost. And then in terms of establishing credibility on the customer side, we definitely had to kind of take some free pilot projects initially, which is kind of a typical way that pharma companies like to work. They kind of put you on a pilot project that might be a project that is currently not an ongoing project at their company. And they might even give that project to 2 or 3 different startups and then sort of compare who they prefer to work with. And then typically that kind of converts into a paid partnership later on. Nowadays, we try to completely avoid these types of free pilots because one issue with free projects in general is that there's little incentive for the other party to really stick to the timelines because they don't really have skin in the game. And it's also a bad signal to investors. So nowadays we move to fully paid projects and ideally with a royalty and milestone component to them. But initially you just kind of need to get a little bit of data, and ideally in those free pilots, you at least arrange that all the expensive experiments that happen in the wet lab are covered by the pharma company rather than you having to foot that bill.
That's super insightful. So going back to the foundation of the company. So yes, there's resources, but there's also the people. And sometimes, or most of the time, the people are really what kind of all you have are the most valuable resources. So could you talk about how you kind of build your team? You know, a lot of the people in our audience might be looking for co-founders or maybe technical expertise or business expertise, but there's so many talented people out there. So how do you go about building a strong foundation for your company through your team?
You want to go first?
Sure. Let's see. So I got real lucky, I guess, because I called up some of my previous colleagues and that was able to start the flywheel effect. But there is trends and like personalities that make good original startups or startup first employees or co-founders. And it's kind of the I don't know. It's this like, hey, we're in it. We're going to give it a shot, even though we don't have a full picture of where it's going to go. And that kind of like adventure spirit, kind of like the seeking understanding and truth and the humility aspect. Those kind of those soft signals from human personalities, I think, are as critical, if not more critical in the early days than someone who's specialized in the industry and kind of knows who to call or what the solution should look like. So I got I certainly would claim luck over skill on this one. And it just happened to be that the colleagues that I called originally had, some of them were of that, like, hey, I'm on board and let's ride and into the dark forest of the unknown. And some of them were like, I know what the path of the forest is kind of supposed to look like. And we can model the original structure of the company and our plans and projects over that. And so if you have a combination of those two things, I think that's kind of two crucial ingredients for starting a good team, I think. What about you, Mark?
Yeah, for me, it was at the very beginning, it was just me and one of my other co-founders, and we were both on kind of the heavy technological side of things. Me with a background in quantum computing, him with a background in software engineering. And so we kind of noticed early on that we need to onboard someone who can really bring the expertise on the biology side. So we ended up recruiting one of our co-founders. He was like a recent PhD graduate here at the university. We didn't know him at the time. We found him online and we ended up going for drinks and pitching the company idea to him. And he ended up turning down his postdoc at Stanford in order to join our company, which was pretty awesome. And then kind of the last missing piece was getting someone to complement us on the business side, because none of us had a background in business or sort of managerial experience. And that's why we onboarded our current CEO, Lucas, who also came through this incubation program because that was embedded at the University of Toronto at the business school there. So he was an MBA graduate there and joined us eventually. And then sort of the team afterwards, we pretty much hired them from all over the world, which is kind of a big advantage being here in Canada, where issuing work permits to people from all over the world is surprisingly easy and simple to do. And that really kind of enables us to not just be confined by what's available here locally, which is sometimes we're struggling with because it's not a traditional biotech hub, but it really allows us to hire from Europe and all over the world, which is kind of great.
Okay, great. We have some questions in the chat, so we'll kind of pivot a little bit to Q&A. The first question is for Mark regarding your incubation experience and how to separate the signal from the noise in an opaque market. So that's the first question. And the second question is for Will, maybe give you some time to think about it. It's from Amesh. Other than pharma and probably communications, are there other domains you believe will benefit from manufacturing or service delivery from space?
Yeah, so in terms of the incubation experience that we had, for me personally, it was an amazing experience because I came straight out of my undergrad, actually, and I had no network in the investment space whatsoever. I didn't know any VCs. I didn't know anything about the logistics of starting a company. And they sort of held our hands all the way through the process, set us up with lawyers that would help us with all the paperwork of incorporating a company, setting up pretty much the entire structure of the corporation. As well as sort of creating that network and giving you an entry point to networking with VCs. I personally didn't find sort of like every 3 months you have these like meetings where kind of you have like 20-minute slots with different investors that give feedback to your pitch or your company. I personally didn't find that feedback too useful because there's only so much useful things that can come out of them hearing about your company for 10 minutes. But for me, it was mainly the network that got built through that. And what I mentioned earlier, sort of this ability of consistently showing that you can execute on the things that you promise. I guess the other question was how to separate the signal from the noise in an opaque market. I'm not quite sure if this means like the peptide therapeutic market or just generally having like a lot of startups at the incubation program. But I'm
yes, probably
like,
the latter given the audience.
Okay, cool. So then in terms of the latter, I guess for us, the main differentiator was that we were kind of consistently able to hit our targets, and just by the sheer time investment of working like 16-hour days, actually being able to generate some really exciting results and secure a pilot project within the time of the incubation program. So retroactively now, like with all the companies that went through the stream with us at the time, it's pretty much just us and another company that survived out of like a cohort of 25 companies. So the attrition rate was quite high, and they would cut companies at every 3 months interval. So it was pretty cutthroat in that sense, but it would sort of be especially rewarding for the people that came out on top.
Well, we're glad you came out on top.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
Go Protein Cure. All right, well.
Literally go big or go home. Yeah, so as far as what else can be manufactured in space? So manufacturing in space is not a new idea. I certainly didn't think of it. It's been around since the 60s, and it's always been throttled by one thing, and that's cost, launch cost specifically. And so the only reason why Varda is viable now economically is because launch costs have dropped so significantly thanks to SpaceX's reusable rockets and the other launch providers that have started coming online as well. And what's really neat is that there really is no saturation point for the products you can create in microgravity, since gravity is a fundamental force, which is all of engineering is built on the 4 fundamental forces of physics. There's a whole world of innovation that can be perpetuated stimulated if you can turn off or modify 25% of the laws of physics. So at first, pharmaceuticals makes the most sense because it's still quite expensive to go to space, and they're the most expensive chemicals on Earth, like I was saying earlier. But what's neat is that you start a positive feedback flywheel for almost any other product you can think of where the manufacturing engineer would want to turn off gravity. So, and the reason how that works is, for example, right now, every satellite company essentially treats their satellites as a capital investment. You put them up once, and then it's a reoccurring revenue model with either telecommunications, bouncing signals off each other, or Earth observation. Either way, it's a capital investment, and even the largest satellite networks have a saturation point. Once the satellite constellation is populated, there's no more real drive for launch. But what's neat is when you start to move like a new innovation curve for manufacturing consumables. In our case, we have, our drive for launch never saturates, because, grandma's always going to need her drugs. So once right now, we've just lowered the threshold for launch, or launch cost enough to have the most expensive chemicals start that flywheel. And once we have one product, that's going to drive global launch cadence to be higher, which is going to lower launch costs, which allows us to have a second economical product, which will further drive launch costs down. And so you get this positive feedback loop that causes launch costs to go into the ground, and the number of products that are now economically viable because they meet the cost of goods threshold up to many. And at that point, when you can get to the point where you have an asymptote at launch costs essentially equaling the fuel it takes to get there, there's a whole host of products. So just to name some few that will get ticked off the list first as this positive feedback continues. First would be pharmaceuticals, fiber optic cables, silicon wafers, and then once years in the future, things like 3D printing of organs, that will start off as tissue growth, because you can grow tissue and do 3D printing of biological material much easier in zero gravity, because you don't need the scaffolding to hold it up as you kind of complete the heart or the ventricle or whatever you're making. So the short answer to the question is there's really no limit to what you can make, as long as the mass associated with whatever product meets launch costs, and that number continues to drop, which means the number of products will continue to go up.
Wow, you can make everything in space, not vinaigrette, right? You can make hearts and kidneys. Amazing. But going off of the launching topic, how do you envision Varda kind of launching in and out of space? And also, are people going to be living in the space station?
So at first, this is the technological timeline vision that we have right now. So we treat launch as a commodity. In order for this business to be viable, that has to be the case. So we go to SpaceX or another launch provider. Our first launch is on SpaceX next year, their Transporter 8 mission. And they provide the launch. So the concept of operations is we build the manufacturing apparatus. It's fully robotic and automated. No humans quite yet. Actually, here's a model right behind me. And the capsule will then take the finished product and come back to Earth, which we can then sell. So then what will happen is kind of a routine launch and re-enter. So you can kind of think of it like, I think space will start to feel more like the ocean. And the reason I think that is because right now, for example, the distance from the shoreline to most oil rigs is about the same distance as ground to space, except, laterally instead of straight up. And so, but we think of the ocean as really close, even though space is just as close as those oil rigs. But we think of it as closer, I think, because the oil rigs are kind of a natural part of the economy. It's a day-to-day thing. And so if space is that way too, I just think it'll feel a lot closer to home. And so you'll just get this routine operation of launching, manufacturing, re-entering with as much of a reusable infrastructure as possible. Long term, once launch costs do drop significantly more, then we could talk about putting humans in orbit. I think about what success means for the company, or signals of success. The first one I think is, an employee at the company can go camping in Utah and they see a shooting star more than once per night, which is one of our capsules coming in. And then, 10 years down the road, another signal of success is that we put a human being in space, the working class human being, and they come back with more money than they went up with, or more value than they went up with. Like right now, everyone who goes to space is just a super expensive meat sack.
Oh, wow. Very, very cool. So question for you, Mark, and I think this is a great question from Adam. How do you prioritize which drugs to pursue or which targets to pursue?
That's a very good question. I guess in the past, we've mainly, our main business model was to partner with pharma companies who would have a very clear idea of what target and what disease they want to focus on in this particular project. So they then typically also have, often it's a proprietary 3D structure, cryo-EM structure of that protein target. And they're looking specifically for molecules that target this particular disease. In the current day-to-day that we're working on is internal drug discovery programs where we kind of pick the disease and the target ourselves, which gives us the advantage to kind of pick something that we know our platform is more amenable to, whereas in the other case, it sometimes might be a hit or miss in terms of how well it aligns with our current platform, and we might have to add more modules and more capabilities. So we've actually spent like several months sort of scouring the literature and evaluating, I think, 20 different targets that we want to potentially pursue. And we narrowed it down to a list of 3, which was mainly balancing kind of the availability of that target, how much data is there already, and how much structural data specifically. And then also what does it entail, how much work does it entail on the wet lab side, because sort of developing completely new assays, so even implementing very complicated assays can cost a lot of time. And we want to be able to kind of iterate quickly and ideally sort of rely on existing assays that exist to test how well we're performing on a particular disease target. But generally, like protein therapeutics are pretty versatile. And the types of disease classes that we typically consider is different types of cancer, obesity, as well as all kinds of autoimmune diseases.
Hey, so Mark, I got a quick question for you. Because we have kind of a similar challenge with both of us having a generic platform for pharma. How do you balance, this is something we always like debate, how do you balance proactively finding targets that make the most sense for your platform while also following the voice of the customer and kind of, do you lean one way or the other, or how do you balance those two?
Yeah, I guess like in terms of, you mean like in terms of the internal programs, or even when working with a partner, sort of trying to steer them in a different direction?
Oh, like finding partners. Like how do you identify partnerships that make sense? Because like the technology platform really well, and they know the application or the hair on fire problem that they have. And like there are times when we see a drug that would be like, oh, this would be perfect for microgravity. But then we have another drug that would be less perfect, but the customer is interested. So like, how do you like organize your business development funnel?
Yeah, like initially we were definitely a bit more lenient when it came to even accepting projects that weren't like completely aligned with what our capabilities are. Nowadays, we're trying to be way more strict with really sticking to our core capabilities because we found that it can be quite a distraction to try and implement new modules that we might not end up using in the future. So like we just got back from the Bio Convention, which is this big partnering conference between pharma companies and small biotech firms.
That's awesome. We were there too.
Oh, nice. Yeah. And so like there, we just really made sure that our deck sort of really narrows down what we're good at and what our capabilities are. And there was a couple of pharma companies that when they hear like, oh, you work on peptides and small proteins, we're not interested in that. And they would just not take the meeting. And we're fine with that. We're much more happy to like not take that meeting rather than wasting time on both sides talking about something that they might not be interested in. So we're really trying to kind of clearly outline what is sort of the range of projects that we might want to accept. And then they typically have a portfolio of projects that they're looking for partners for. And then there hopefully is a match. Otherwise, we try to really generally limit, like nowadays, we don't really do a lot of partnerships with external pharma, and we're really trying to make the internal projects our main goal, simply because we own a bigger part of the pie at the end of the day if we also decide the disease target and then kind of push those molecules ideally just after the animal studies and then sort of shop it around to pharma companies. So in that case, when picking the target, we really try to also focus on sort of the commercial aspects of it, and if it is something that pharma companies are currently interested in, rather than just developing a molecule for a target that might work for our platform, but that might not be commercially interesting.
Fascinating. Cool.
Great question, Bill. So moving on, for the both of you, we're going to pivot to challenges and wins. But what have been the biggest challenges or challenge that you've kind of faced? And what has been the biggest win?
I guess the biggest challenge we've faced, I would say building the team and then actually shipping the spacecraft. So we just had our largest company milestone last week where so we pitched the company in at the end of 2020, kind of like around the holidays, and our first day on the job was January 18th of 2021, and we had a schedule planned to build and deliver our first spacecraft by last week. And so we actually stuck to the target. And I think that was, I don't know if that's, it was pretty significant in the aerospace company or industry when it usually schedules slip. So we're super proud of that. I would say that's the biggest company milestone and like the biggest challenge. And the way we overcame it was recruiting basically. So strong team and really good culture. So I think like there being an emphasis on team and I kind of think of Varda as almost like an organism that has to stay healthy. And so it's one of these like tough problems that you just got to kind of work on every day. And it's the opposite of a chronic illness. It's like a chronic benefit if you keep feeding good vibes and good like leadership as well as attention to like a positive culture.
On my end, I guess like one of our biggest challenges has been sort of all the wet lab experimentation because initially we still do work with a lot of CROs, contract research organizations that can essentially handle the synthesis of our molecules as well as running various assays and actually executing the experiments. And initially we kind of thought, we could sort of outsource all of the wet lab to external parties. And over time, we kind of noticed that it's an extreme challenge to sort of coordinate all of them because typically it's one CRO making the molecules and another one doing the experiments, and the molecules have to be shipped around all over the world. And if there's problems, it gets really difficult to kind of debug them and try to advance something because it's not actually your in-house team doing it. So kind of making sure that our internal programs are successful, we've kind of started in-housing a lot of these complex assays and essentially building our own wet lab, which has been difficult and non-trivial because it requires hiring a completely new skill set of people, because previously we had a very intense skew towards the computational side. And now like 25% of our company are actual wet lab bench scientists, which initially we didn't think we would need, but just doing the validation, and before we submit something to a pharma company, we want to run a couple tests as well as generate our own in-house data sets to improve our ML models. So just sort of doing all of the logistics and kind of breaking into the wet lab space has been tricky and challenging.
Yeah, that's really interesting that Protein Cure would need a wet lab. Could you just kind of talk more about that? Like, why is a wet lab kind of necessary? And maybe talk about some of the technologies that you're most excited about to kind of help with this effort.
Sure. Yeah, I got to be honest, like we definitely started out a bit naive early on, where we thought we can just do computational work. We don't need any experiments. We can like basically have the experiments being done by our pharma partners. And then over time, as I said, validation is important. And we realized that we also need to actually generate our own ML data sets. So one very exciting piece of technology that I'm excited about on that side is so-called cloud labs. So if you think about cloud computing with, for example, Amazon Web Services, you rent a space or a little bit of a server that you can run some compute on for like, let's say an hour. And a cloud lab is a similar idea, but now you're renting a physical box that has various machines in it, and it's all automated with robots. And I can sit here in Toronto and program the machines that might be in a lab somewhere in the Bay Area, and it can execute my experimental protocol and sort of do that repetitively over and over. And I can monitor all of it in real time on my computer here. And so that really and that's something that we kind of want to break into, because that would shorten the cycle so that our ML team could build a model, make some predictions, submit those to the automated cloud lab, and then get the results ideally in like 1 to 2 weeks, which would be quite a tremendous progress, because right now it typically takes like 3 to 6 months for the machine learning team to sort of get some feedback on how their models were performing and to refine them.
All right, so we have another question in the chat. Will, this is actually for you. Regarding wet labs, do you need a wet lab in BARDA to validate what you kind of prepare in space, kind of like a quality control, quality assurance type of program?
Totally. So it's actually funny. I was going to ask Mark a follow-up question there as well. So we also use cloud labs as part of our pipeline. So the way it works is we have multiple drugs that we're considering reformulation for, and we do multiple processes on the ground first to determine what and how we can affect them in the way they want to be affected for microgravity. I guess that's not really the direct answer to the question, but we do use it as part of the pipeline for use cases for us. But as far as when we actually perform the manufacturing operation in orbit, we are very careful to only perform the operation that absolutely requires microgravity, just because it's still so expensive to go to space. So there's a lot that happens, of course, with any manufacturing process, and pharmaceuticals is no different. Many steps along the way, and we isolate the steps for flight that are only require microgravity. And then so we have preparation steps on the ground, we have post-op steps on the ground, and then a very limited amount of steps, the very limited, or the most limited as possible in microgravity. And for that, we are kind of a single box operation. So from a GMP, or good manufacturing process perspective, we look like a single unit operation on the bench. It's just that pay no attention that this box is going to space situation. But within the control volume of the box, it would be treated as any other box in a manufacturing process in a pharma lab, cloud or otherwise, or a pharma manufacturing facility. At the end of the day, our customers really don't care that we're going to space. If we could just create an anti-gravity box in the back of the lab, they would much prefer that.
Nice. So another question for you, Will. Are you concerned about the Kessler syndrome, aka space junk, endangering space-based manufacturing? No idea what that is.
Yeah. So Kessler syndrome is essentially a chain reaction that theoretically could occur if you had two satellites hit one another in orbit. Since they're going 17,000 miles an hour, you basically get a collision. A ton of shards of metal and other materials come off like bullets, and those bullets hits more satellites, which causes more bullets, and then you just get this chain reaction of satellites being destroyed, destroying other satellites, and now you just have this cloud of metal shards whizzing around the Earth in every sort of direction, so that our space program and humanity is forever confined to Earth. So that's the worst case scenario. There's a few mitigations to that theoretical risk. First is that most satellites will be low enough where there's still some atmospheric drag. And so, over years, and not that many years, just a few years, those particulates can come back down to Earth. Now, of course, it depends on the altitude. The other good thing that mitigates Kessler syndrome for manufacturing is that we're only in space for the microgravity. So we actually are very incentivized to go as low as possible, right above that atmosphere, still within like the really small amounts of atmosphere that exist, because for every foot higher that we go, we have to pay more in fuel, and you have to pay both to get to and from space. So we want to go as low as possible. And so that means that we're still kind of in the soup, if you will, of the atmosphere. And Our satellites will decay if all of a sudden they went unresponsive, or they did create shards. They would decay within a few months. So the manufacturing industry, or in-orbit manufacturing, certainly won't cause Kessler syndrome. And I think that just the sheer amount of, like, if you imagine space, it is just a concentric sphere that is larger than Earth, and there's a lot of stuff on Earth. So and there's a lot of space, so the amount of stuff in space is way more less than the stuff on Earth, obviously. And so there's just a very low probability of them hitting, and then even if they do, you have this decay effect and our commercial incentives. So it's definitely something to keep in mind and be concerned about, because it's a humanitarian existential thing. But we have a lot of mitigations working in our favor as a space civilization.
Wow. Well, Kessler syndrome sounds like a serious thing. I hope that doesn't happen. My goodness.
Definitely sounds like a horrible disease that we should find a cure.
Yeah. I thought it was an immunodeficiency or something. That is way more serious than that. Okay. Back to you, Mark. So how does, this is kind of maybe going back to the technology question, but how does Google DeepMind's AlphaFold 2 impact your business? And could you kind of just tell us what that is too? Because yeah, I do not know what that is. So that would be super helpful.
Sure. So probably a lot of people have heard of Google DeepMind being sort of this visionary AI sub arm of Google, where they do a lot of foundational research and build very exciting models. So the thing that a lot of people might have heard of is AlphaGo, which was the AI model that played the Chinese board game of Go at superhuman capability. And they kind of started going further than that and building models for various problems. And in this case, AlphaFold focuses on protein folding or protein structure prediction. So the idea is that a protein is like the string that consists of individual building blocks, which are called amino acids. And you're trying to predict what kind of 3D shape this would take up once it is put into solution. And it's a very non-trivial problem. It's extremely difficult to do this computationally. And Google DeepMind had this big breakthrough where they were able to build an ML model that can go from sequence to structure in a very short time. And there's a yearly competition called CASP, which is a protein structure prediction challenge. And they pretty much blew everyone out of the field and were able to kind of accelerate and have extremely good results, which is something that investors are asking us a lot about in terms of how that impacts our business. And the short answer is that it is a small part in the drug discovery pipeline that we run every day. But there's a lot of other components that play a big role. For example, once you figured out that 3D structure, you need to do docking calculations where you're trying to figure out how that molecule fits into the protein target binding site. You need to predict all kinds of properties and optimize them. And so in our case, we've kind of integrated AlphaFold into our stack, but we tend to complement it with a lot of other methods, and sort of like all the post-processing that happens afterwards is very crucial too. And one of the big shortcomings of AlphaFold is that it is trained mostly on larger proteins, and that's also where it tends to perform the best. Whereas in the peptide and small protein space, it tends to have lower accuracy. So that's where kind of running molecular dynamic simulations and applying more physics-based approaches still tends to outperform the results that AlphaFold can generate.
Wow, that almost sounds like an impossible task. So go Google, they're doing everything, aren't they?
They do. Kind of scary.
All right, so we have about 5 minutes left, and I kind of want to pivot to something more fun. So a question about the day-to-day life of a founder / CEO / head of R&D. So what is it like? What does your day-to-day look like? Is it glamorous? Do you start your day off with a nice coffee, matcha latte? What does it look like?
What do you think, Mark? I feel like yours is probably more interesting than mine.
Well, let's see. Okay, I guess my day-to-day, there's a lot of managing sort of the research components of the company, making sure that these internal programs are running smoothly and doing the project management when it comes to that. But I also personally still get into the nitty-gritty of the various projects. So I still tend to write a lot of code. And in my specific case, we have a lot of computational biologists that write code that can, for example, simulate molecules, but they typically write it in a way that is able to run on their laptop and maybe process like tens of molecules. Whereas my goal is then to take that code and optimize it and sort of scale it to the cloud so that we can run it on 10,000s of processes in parallel and sort of be able to have a throughput of millions of molecules. So a lot of my day-to-day is a lot of cloud engineering and software optimization in order to make it amenable to high-performance computing. And then there's obviously, I guess, sort of the founder responsibilities when it comes to sort of thinking about long-term strategy. When it comes to fundraising, it still is like pretty much all hands on deck. We all get involved in optimizing the pitch deck and sort of coming up with the general strategy of how much money we want to raise and what we need it for. And yeah, that's pretty much how my day-to-day looks like. I tend to drink a lot of matcha instead of coffee, just simply because I don't like coffee too much.
It's better for you, I heard. I heard it's very high in antioxidants. And how does quantum computing kind of fit in your day-to-day? Does that kind of take up a lot of, time and attention and resources? And feel free to add in on that, Will, if you also kind of include quantum computing in your work as well.
We don't, unfortunately. So I think it's all you, Mark. We specifically
Sure.
don't want our spacecraft to learn.
Well, like in our case, we started out at the quantum computing stream at this incubator program. And initially it was a strong focus of ours. My background is in quantum computing. And so we developed a range of algorithms that can be applied to protein folding as well as protein-protein docking. However, that was 5 years ago, and people were very optimistic about how quickly quantum hardware is going to scale. But unfortunately, that hasn't really been true. So Google, IBM, all of the big companies have built quantum computers successfully, but they simply haven't tackled enough of the engineering challenges that are still preventing it from scaling to the size where it would be commercially viable. So right now we're kind of stuck in this space where you can develop theoretical algorithms and you can do some small proof of principle implementations, but you can't really run the types of calculations that would really benefit our day-to-day partnerships. So that's why nowadays we pretty much focus exclusively on classical supercomputing technologies and AI. And there's sort of this long-term R&D focus on quantum computing, which is definitely a little bit on the back burner right now because we simply need to wait for the hardware to advance.
All right, we just got a very nice comment. You could not have chosen more interesting or more knowledgeable participants. Go, Mark and Will.
Thank you.
And just going back to Will, we really want to know if you drink matcha lattes too. Could you just tell us what your day-to-day kind of looks like as well?
Yeah, so let's see. I wake up in the morning usually to my significant other shouting in her office because she works Eastern hours. And then after waving politely on the way out, I drive my two-seater little convertible down the 405 in LA to our space factory where we build spacecraft every day with my close friends. And we just hit about 60 employees. So we've gotten to the point where every department now has a solid crew and a lead. And so most of my day, once I get into the office, is working. First, I check to make sure everyone is happy, healthy, and effective, and then check in with what the hottest issues of each department are in the day and make sure that those issues and the way that we're tackling those issues or those things we're working on are coherent with every department in the company. And if they're not, then helping the community, provide they call them at Varda, they call them executive steers, and I just want this like little male cow that's in a tuxedo on my desk as the executive steer, and so I provide a little bit of guidance wherever needed to make sure that every department is moving in a coherent way, and that's pretty much it. That in the abstract leads to a day that is different every day. But then after that, go home and crash around 8 p.m. and do it all again the next day.
Right. Well, sounds like busy days, you guys. Hopefully, you guys can relax and maybe just watch some Hulu or something. Um, but thank you to Mark and Will. They were so gracious to give us some time and share their words of wisdoms with us. And thank you for everyone in the audience for tuning in. Hope you got a lot of valuable information. I know I did. And don't forget for any candidates to possibly sign up for the Bio Entrepreneurship Initiative this upcoming cycle. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you
me.
for having us.